5:07 p.m., a small flower shop on a quiet Boston corner. The scent of roses filled the air as Elias, a 41-year-old single dad, trimmed a bridal bouquet. Suddenly, a black Mercedes screeched to a halt. Clara, a powerful CEO, stepped out with eyes burning in fury. "Did you send these to my office?" she demanded. Elias nodded calmly. Without a word, she threw the flowers down, crushing them under her heels before wrecking the shop in a blind rage. But hours later, when she walked into a hospital room and saw Elias, she froze in absolute silence. Elias was a man who understood that beauty was fragile but persistent. At 41, his face bore the quiet lines of a life that had known both deep joy and profound sorrow. 6 years ago, his world had been shattered when his wife passed away after a long battle with illness. At the time, he was a successful landscape engineer, designing grand parks and corporate gardens, but the high-pressure world of blueprints and deadlines felt hollow without her. He needed a life that allowed him to be a father first. He traded his drafting table for a pair of shears and opened a small flower shop in a historic corner of Boston. It wasn't about the profit, it was about the peace. He wanted a sanctuary where he could raise his daughter Sophie and remind himself that even after the harshest winter, things still grow. Elias lived his life in the rhythm of the seasons. He knew when the peonies would bloom and when the hydrangeas would fade. He was the kind of man who spoke softly to his plants and even softer to his daughter. Elias spent his evenings teaching Sophie the language of flowers. To him, a marigold wasn't just a yellow petal. It was a symbol of grief and celebration intertwined. He often told her that a garden is a mirror of the soul. If you neglect it, it withers. But if you love it through the storms, it rewards you with resilience. This philosophy was reflected in every corner of his shop. The wooden floors were aged and creaked underfoot, but they were always swept clean. The air didn't just smell of flowers, it smelled of damp earth and the promise of a new morning. He worked long hours, his hands often calloused and stained with chlorophyll, but he never complained. Every stem he trimmed was a silent prayer for a world that felt increasingly cold and mechanical. On a typical morning, before the city noise became a roar, Elias and 10-year-old Sophie would walk through the local wholesale market together. They would pick out the freshest stems, their breath fogging in the cool morning air. Sophie had her father's observant eyes and a natural talent for color. She would hold up a deep purple iris against a pale yellow tulip, asking for his approval. "Why do you like flowers so much, Dad?" she asked one morning as they arranged a display of sunflowers in the front window. Elias paused, his hands resting on the edge of a ceramic vase. He looked at his daughter, seeing so much of his late wife in her smile. "Because they remind people that life keeps growing, Sophie. No matter how many times a flower is cut, the earth finds a way to bring it back. They are a promise that beauty always returns." This was the philosophy that kept him grounded. He wasn't just selling plants, he was selling moments of hope and connection. In a glass skyscraper just a few miles away, Clara lived a life that was the polar opposite of Elias's garden. At 35, she was the CEO of a major real estate empire, a woman who had fought her way to the top of a male-dominated industry through sheer force of will. Clara was strong, decisive, and used to controlling every variable in her environment. She didn't have time for the fragile or the fleeting. Her life was measured in square footage, interest rates, and closing dates. She lived in a world of sharp angles and cold surfaces where a single mistake could cost millions. She had learned early on that to show emotion was to show a target. She wore her authority like a suit of armor, rarely letting anyone see the exhaustion that tugged at the corners of her eyes when the office lights went dim. She believed that vulnerability was a weakness, and that the only way to survive was to be harder than the world around you. However, beneath the expensive suits and the sharp tongue, Clara was carrying a heavy burden. Her mother, Lydia, the only person who truly knew the girl behind the CEO, had been struggling with her health. The pressure of maintaining a multi-million-dollar company while facing her mother's mortality was starting to crack Clara's iron exterior. Every night, she would sit in her dark penthouse, staring at the city lights, feeling like a ghost in her own kingdom. She felt as though she were holding up the weight of the world, and she was terrified that if she let go even for a second, everything would crumble into dust. On this particular day, Clara was having the worst day of her professional career. A massive deal she had spent 18 months brokering, a project that would have redefined the city's skyline, had just collapsed due to a legal technicality. Her investors were panicking, her board of directors was questioning her leadership, and the stress was like a physical weight on her chest. Her phone had been ringing incessantly for 6 hours, each notification a new fire to extinguish. She walked into her office to find a beautiful, hand-tied bouquet of wildflowers sitting on her mahogany desk. There was no name on the card, only a short, handwritten note. For someone who deserves kindness today. To anyone else, it would have been a lovely gesture. To Clara, in her state of high-tensile stress and paranoia, it felt like a mockery. She assumed a rival was laughing at her failure, sending flowers as if she were at a funeral for her career. The scent of the lilies, normally so sweet, felt suffocating. She grabbed the card, her knuckles white, and searched for the florist's logo. Finding the address for Elias's shop, she grabbed her keys and headed for the elevator, her heels clicking like a drumbeat of war. The drive to the old part of Boston did nothing to cool Clara's temper. Every red light was an insult, every slow pedestrian a personal affront. Her grip on the steering wheel was so tight her fingers turned white. She pulled her Mercedes onto the sidewalk in front of the flower shop, not caring about the parking signs or the curious glances from passers-by. She burst through the door, the small bell chiming a cheerful greeting that was completely out of sync with her mood. The shop was a sea of color and calm, a place that felt frozen in a more peaceful time. Elias was at the counter, his back to her, working on a delicate arrangement of white roses for a wedding. He didn't turn immediately, finishing his cut before setting the shears down with surgical precision. "I'll be with you in just a second," he said, his voice low and steady, like the hum of a cello. Clara didn't wait. She marched to the counter and slammed the wildflowers down, water droplets spraying across the polished wood. "Did you send these to my office?" she demanded, her voice trembling with suppressed rage. Elias turned slowly. He looked at the bouquet, then at the woman standing before him. He didn't see a powerful CEO. He saw a woman whose eyes were wide with a pain she was trying to hide behind anger. He saw the tremor in her hands and the way her jaw was clenched so tight it must have hurt. He nodded calmly. "I did," he replied, his tone devoid of any aggression. Clara felt something snap inside her. The frustration of the failed deal, the fear for her mother, and the perceived insult of the flowers converged into a single point of fury. "Who paid you to mock me?" she hissed. "Who told you I needed your pity? Do you think a few cheap weeds can fix my day?" Before Elias could respond, Clara swept her arm across the display counter in a violent arc. 3 large glass vases filled with water and fresh lilies crashed to the floor, the sound of breaking glass echoing through the small space like a gunshot. She didn't stop there. She grabbed a nearby rack of pre-made arrangements and shoved it over. Petals were crushed, stems were snapped, and water soaked into the ancient wooden floorboards. She was a whirlwind of destruction, tearing apart the only thing in the room that was beautiful and defenseless. The scent of crushed jasmine filled the air, thick and cloying. Clara stood in the center of the wreckage, her hair disheveled, her expensive suit stained with flower water. She looked like a conqueror standing over a ruined city, yet she felt more hollow than ever. The shop was in ruins in less than a minute. The air was thick with the scent of bruised greenery and the heavy silence of shock. Elias's assistant, a young college student, stood frozen in the corner, her eyes wide with terror, clutching a spray bottle like a shield. But Elias didn't move. He didn't shout. He didn't even flinch when a shard of glass skated across the floor toward his boots. He simply stood there, his hands resting on the counter, watching Clara as she breathed heavily, her chest heaving with the exhaustion of her outburst. He didn't look at the broken vases. He looked at her. "You ruined everything," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Elias looked at her with a profound sense of empathy that made Clara feel even more exposed. "You look like you've had a very hard day," he said quietly. There was no judgment in his voice, only a simple observation of fact. This was the final straw for Clara. She had expected him to yell, to call the police, to demand payment. His kindness felt like an attack on her defenses. "Don't you dare talk to me like that," she shouted, her voice breaking. "You have no idea what my life is like. You're just a man in a flower shop. You sell things that die in a week. You know nothing of real pressure." She turned on her heel and stormed out, her Mercedes tires screeching as she sped away, leaving a trail of exhaust in the evening air. Elias stood in the center of the devastation. He looked at the crushed roses, the broken glass, and the pools of water that mirrored the dimming sky. He didn't feel angry. He felt a deep, hollow sadness for a woman who was so lost in her own storm that she felt the need to destroy a garden just to feel a sense of power. He began to pick up the pieces, one shard at a time, while Sophie watched from the doorway of the back room, her small face filled with confusion. "Why was that lady so sad, Dad?" she asked. Elias looked at his daughter and forced a small, tired smile. "Some people don't know how to ask for help, Sophie, so they break things instead." The sun had set by the time Clara reached the hospital. The anger that had fueled her all afternoon had dissipated, leaving behind a cold, numbing exhaustion that felt like lead in her veins. She walked through the sterile, white corridors toward the oncology wing where her mother, Lydia, was being monitored. The smell of antiseptic and floor wax was a harsh contrast to the floral scent that still clung to Clara's clothes. The hospital was quiet, save for the rhythmic beeping of monitors and the soft shuffle of nurses' shoes. She pushed open the door to room 402, expecting to see her mother sleeping, looking frail and defeated. Instead, she found Lydia sitting up in bed, the moonlight from the window illuminating a face that looked more vibrant than it had in weeks. She was holding a small hand-tied bouquet of wildflowers, the exact same flowers Clara had destroyed just hours before. Clara froze in the doorway, her hand still on the handle. Her heart began to race, a cold sweat breaking out on her forehead. "Mom, where did those come from?" Lydia looked up, her face lighting up with a genuine smile that reached her tired eyes. "Oh, Clara, look. Aren't they beautiful? A kind man from that little flower shop on the corner sent them over this afternoon. The nurse said he comes by every Tuesday and Friday, like clockwork. He sends these little bundles of joy for the lonely hearts in the wing, the patients who don't get many visitors. He says everyone deserves to see something that hasn't given up on life." Clara's breath caught in her throat. She felt as if the floor had suddenly dropped out from under her. The walls of the hospital room seemed to close in. He just sends them. For free?" Lydia nodded, stroking a delicate blue petal with a frail hand. "He told the nurses once that flowers make hospitals feel less like waiting rooms and more like gardens. He said everyone deserves a bit of kindness when they're fighting a battle they might not win. He's a widower, you know. He lost his wife here years ago. He told me that when he looks at these flowers, he feels like life is still moving forward. He told me that even if we are at our end, we shouldn't forget that the world is still full of color." The realization hit Clara like a physical blow to the stomach. The bouquet on her desk hadn't been a mockery from a rival. It had been a gift. Elias had likely prepared a batch for the hospital and sent one to her office by error. Or perhaps he had seen her looking stressed through the shop window a few days prior and simply wanted to offer a stranger a moment of peace. And she had responded by smashing his sanctuary. She had crushed the very flowers meant to bring light to the dying and the sick. She had insulted a man who used his own grief to fuel the hope of others. Clara sat down in the plastic chair next to her mother's bed, her legs suddenly feeling like water. "What's wrong, dear? You look like you've seen a ghost," Lydia said, reaching out to take Clara's hand. Clara couldn't speak. She looked at the wildflowers in her mother's lap and saw not just plants, but the immense, quiet heart of the man she had just tried to ruin. Lydia continued, unaware of the turmoil in her daughter's soul. "The nurses say he's a saint. He doesn't have much, just that little shop, but he makes sure the elderly patients always have something fresh to look at. He says it's his way of keeping his wife's memory alive. She loved the spring, apparently. She used to say that a flower doesn't think of competing with the flower next to it. It just blooms. He lives by that." Clara closed her eyes and all she could see was Elias's face, calm, steady, and filled with that unbearable kindness Even as she destroyed his work, she remembered his words. "You look like you've had a hard day." He hadn't been patronizing her. He had been offering her the same grace he offered the patients in this ward. She felt a wave of nausea. She was the CEO of a multi-million-dollar company, but in that moment, she felt like the poorest, smallest person in the world. She realized that while she was busy building towers of concrete that would eventually crumble, Elias was building a legacy of light that would outlast them all. Clara stayed with her mother until she fell asleep, but her mind was miles away, replaying the events of the afternoon over and over. Every time she closed her eyes, she heard the sound of breaking glass. As soon as the nurses did their final rounds, Clara slipped out of the hospital. She didn't go home to her luxury penthouse or call her assistant to vent. She drove back to the quiet corner in Old Boston. It was nearly midnight, and the streets were deserted, the streetlights casting long, lonely shadows on the pavement. She expected the shop to be dark and locked, but as she turned the corner, she saw a soft glow coming from the window. The plywood hadn't been put up yet, leaving the interior exposed like an open wound. She parked her car and walked toward the glass door, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Through the window, she saw Elias. He was alone in the shop. The overhead lights were dimmed, but he was working by the light of a single desk lamp that threw golden light across the floor. He was on his hands and knees, carefully picking up the last of the glass shards with his bare hands. The broken vases were gone, but the floor was still damp in places, reflecting the lamp's glow. He moved slowly, with the same deliberate care he used when trimming roses. Clara watched him for a long time, the sight of him cleaning up the mess she had made in her privilege and rage feeling like a knife in her heart. She realized he wasn't just cleaning a floor, he was mending a broken piece. She finally gathered the courage to push open the door. The bell chimed again, sounding mournful in the midnight air. Elias didn't look up immediately. "We're closed for repairs, I'm afraid," he said, his voice tired but still gentle, devoid of any bitterness. "I know," Clara whispered, her voice barely a thread. Elias froze. He slowly stood up, brushing the dust from his knees. He looked at her, and for the first time Clara saw the true extent of the exhaustion behind his eyes. He didn't look angry. He just looked weary, like a man who had spent his life holding things together while others tried to tear them apart. "I went to the hospital," Clara began, her voice shaking uncontrollably. "My mother, she's in the oncology wing. She had your flowers. She told me what you do. She told me about your wife." She stopped, a sob catching in her throat, a physical pain in her chest. "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I thought someone was making fun of me. I've been so stressed, and I took it all out on you. I acted like a monster." Elias looked at her, and the tension in his shoulders seemed to melt away. He walked over to a nearby stool and sat down, gesturing for her to do the same. The shop felt different in the dark, smaller, more intimate. "Flowers break easily, Clara," he said, his voice echoing in the quiet shop. "But they grow again. The glass can be replaced. The petals will return. What's harder to fix is a heart that's been hardened by the world." Clara shook her head, tears finally spilling over. "It's not just the shop. It's how I acted. You were trying to be kind, and I tried to destroy you. I called you a man in a flower shop like it was a bad thing. But you're the strongest person I've ever met." Elias looked at her with a knowing smile. "Kindness is often the hardest thing for people to accept when they feel like they're failing," he said. "When we feel weak, we want to prove we're strong. But real strength isn't in how much you can control. It's in how much you can endure without losing your gentleness. I wasn't trying to destroy you. I was trying to remind you that you're human. We all break sometimes, Clara. Even CEOs." They talked for hours in the middle of the ruined shop. Clara told him about the failed deal, about her fear for her mother, and about the hollow feeling of her successful life. She confessed that she had forgotten what it felt like to just breathe without a deadline. Elias told her about his wife, about the struggle of being a single father, and why he chose to give away his best work to people he would never meet. He told her that flowers were his way of talking to a world that had forgotten how to listen. By the time the first hint of gray light appeared in the sky, A new understanding had been forged between them. Clara didn't just want to pay for the damages. She wanted to change the very foundation of her life. "I want to help you," she said, her voice firm now, the CEO tone returning but softened by a new purpose. "Not just with the repairs. I want to upgrade this place. I want to make sure you have the best refrigeration, the best tools, the best space to create, and I want to set up a foundation, a permanent fund so that every hospital in this city gets flowers every single day in your wife's name. I want to make sure that no lonely heart is ever without color again." Elias looked at her, moved by the sincerity in her eyes. He saw that she wasn't trying to buy his forgiveness. She was trying to join his mission. "I'll agree to the repairs," he said softly, "and I'll agree to the foundation, but only if the flowers continue to be given by hand. It's the connection that matters, Clara, not just the petals. If we lose the human touch, we're just selling products again." Clara nodded, realizing that for the first time in years, she wasn't negotiating a contract. She was making a promise to her own soul. 1 year later, the corner of the old street looked the same from the outside, but inside it was a revolution of color and life. The growing promise was now the most renowned floral boutique in Boston. It had been expanded into the neighboring building, featuring a large greenhouse where rare orchids and exotic ferns thrived under a glass roof. There were more employees now, many of them students or people looking for a fresh start, whom Elias had trained personally. He taught them not just how to arrange stems, but how to listen to the stories behind the orders. But despite the growth in the state-of-the-art equipment Clara had insisted on, the heart of the shop remained unchanged. The tradition of the Lonely Hearts bouquets had grown into a citywide movement, with Clara's company providing the logistics to deliver thousands of smiles to hospitals and nursing homes every week. Clara herself had undergone a transformation. She was still a CEO, but her leadership style had changed. She spoke less and listened more. She realized that her employees weren't just assets on a balance sheet. They were people with lives and gardens of their own. She spent her weekends at the shop, sometimes helping Sophie with her homework or learning the intricacies of grafting roses. The hard, cold edges of her personality had been softened by the constant presence of growing things. Her mother Lydia had gone into remission, a miracle she partially attributed to the healing power of the man with the flowers. Elias was at the counter, showing Sophie how to arrange a complex centerpiece for a charity gala. Sophie was taller now, her movements mirroring her father's grace and quiet focus. She looked up as the door opened and the familiar bell rang. Clara walked in, but she wasn't wearing a power suit or a frown. She was dressed in a simple sundress, her face relaxed and her eyes bright with a peace she had once thought impossible. She didn't look like a woman who was at war with the world anymore. She looked like a woman who had finally come home. She was carrying a box of pastries from the bakery down the street. "Is the lead designer available for a lunch break?" she asked with a grin that lit up the room. Elias laughed, setting down his shears and wiping his hands on his apron. "I think we can find a window in the schedule," he replied. They sat on the bench outside the shop, watching the city wake up around them. Clara looked at the vibrant displays in the window and thought back to the day she had tried to smash it all. It felt like a lifetime ago, a memory from a different person's life. "Why didn't you get angry that day, Elias?" she asked, a question that had been in the back of her mind for a year. "I was so horrible to you. I destroyed your work. Most people would have called the police or hated me forever." Elias took a bite of a croissant and looked out at the street, a thoughtful expression on his face. "Because angry people usually need kindness more than anyone else, Clara," he said simply. "Anger is just a shield we use when we're too tired to hold up our own weight. If I had fought you, I would have just been hitting the shield. By being kind, I was talking to the person hiding behind it, and I could tell she was a good person who was just very, very tired." Clara leaned her head on his shoulder, feeling a deep sense of gratitude for the man who had seen through her armor. She had lost a real estate deal that day a year ago, but she had gained a soul. She had learned that the most important things in life aren't built of stone and glass, but of empathy and resilience. She looked at the flower shop and realized it wasn't just a business. It was a testament to the fact that beauty always finds a way, even through the cracks in the pavement. As they sat there, Sophie came running out with a single perfect red rose, its petals velvet and deep. She handed it to Clara with a shy smile. "For someone who deserves kindness today," the young girl said, repeating the words that had started it all. Clara took the rose, its scent sweet and clear, and for the first time in her life, she didn't feel the need to control anything. She just felt like growing. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to HITL Stories for more inspiring tales of hope, redemption, and the beautiful ways our lives intertwine. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss a new story. Join our community and let's share the kindness that makes the world a garden. Thank you for watching and for being part of our journey. She came to destroy his small world with her power, but his kindness was the only thing powerful enough to save hers. We often mistake silence for weakness and rage for strength, but the strongest thing in the world is a heart that refuses to harden. In her anger, she found a man she could have ruined. In her regret, she found the man who helped her bloom. Because life, like a flower, always finds a way to grow through the cracks. And sometimes the person who breaks you is the only one who can help you heal.